A young man, troubled and grieving, meets a mysterious woman at Airport Mesa, a mysterious Arizona rock formation said to be a vortex for strange forces. Their connection is immediate, with a magnetic pull that draws them together, yet what appears to be the love of his life soon turns into a devastating supernatural mystery, with a turn of events that defy explanation. I'm Peter Laws, inviting you into the fog for a perplexing puzzle of love and loss, which asks, was this woman a blessing or a curse? And more to the point, where did she go? If you want to listen to these episodes on the go, then did you know there is an audio equivalent podcast? Yes, just search in anywhere you get your podcasts for Into the Fog with Peter Laws, and you'll find all of the episodes that you'll find in video in audio format, so you can listen out and about. Thank you. Tonight's case happened in 1992 to a writer from New York. His name was Cary. I do not know his surname. He was trying to find the time to work on his novel. He'd been working on it for 2 years, but he also had to make a living, and so he worked as a freelance writer for various magazines. He was 34 years old. In the spring of 1992, Cary received a tragic phone call. His father was dying, and Cary would have to head straight home to be at his side for the end. So he headed back to Prescott, which is about 2,500 miles to the west in Arizona. This was the place he had grown up in, and this part of the world held both happy and heartbreaking memories for Cary. Once he was back in Prescott, Cary sat with his father, and it was not that long until he passed away, which left Cary alone in his hometown for a while. And he really was alone, because his mother and sister had sadly died in a car accident just outside of Phoenix, Arizona. That was back in 1984. By then, Cary had already left Prescott. He'd moved away in 1981. And so he hadn't lived in his hometown for over 10 years. And so the thought crossed his mind, should he move back here? After all, his dad had decent insurance coverage, so most of the medical bills were going to be covered. This meant that he could hold on to his dad's house in Prescott. However, after the reading of the will, Cary learned that not only did his dad leave him the house, but there was a substantial amount of money left to him as well. And he realized that he could move back to New York, get a better apartment, but he could also spend that time focusing on writing his novel instead of doing all of these freelance assignments for magazines. I've been a novelist myself, so I know the dream scenario of being able to focus purely on writing a book. And so Cary decided he would sell the house and head back to New York. But first he had to sort through all of his parents' things. And he began that strange and sad task, perhaps you have experienced this yourself, of going through the bits and the pieces of the house you grew up in, deciding what to keep, what to give away, what to throw away. It's not easy. It was especially hard when he had to sort through old family photographs, showing various stages of the family's life. Especially hard was seeing his late sister who had died in the crash. Now, I first heard of this case from paranormal researcher Brad Steiger, and Steiger says that in the interview, Cary was very open to admit that during this time he started to cry at these pictures of his sister, and why wouldn't he? This was an overwhelming experience to suddenly find himself totally alone. The house clearance took something out of him. He was becoming sad and morose with every passing day, and he started to worry that he was not going to be in a very good place mentally to start work on his novel. And so as he sat among the cardboard boxes in a desperately quiet home, he had a revelation. He'd just come into a bunch of money, which meant he didn't have to get straight on to the novel. In New York, maybe he needed a break to settle his sadness. So what better than a change of scenery? Not New York, not Prescott, but another place in Arizona that he had always loved. The Red Rocks of Sedona. Sedona is a part of the world that is not only known for its striking beauty, but it has become a beacon for people seeking an otherworldly experience. That was precisely what was about to happen to Cary. Cary's parents had taken him and Andrea to Sedona when they were kids, so it was special to him, and he was feeling a little bit energized when he made the 60-mile trip from Prescott to spend some time among the canyon walls and the mountain peaks. And he was enjoying seeing the sights there, though it was difficult to shift that sense of melancholy after everything that had happened. He'd first come to Sedona with his family in the 1970s, Now it was the early 1990s, and he had become aware that the place was even more of a haven for the arts and spiritual seekers. You see, the rocks of Sedona are sometimes described as a cathedral without walls, and people believe there is spiritual power there. Some crystal healers believe that there are healing properties in the crystals that are widespread throughout the rocks. Others are drawn to the area because of the spiritual significance to Native American cultures. Carrie was also aware that Sedona is known for its links to vortex theory. The Sedona vortexes, or vortices, are thought to be swirling areas of energy that, when walked into, can create a powerful space for meditation, healing, creativity, self-discovery. Some say they visit these areas in Sedona and feel rejuvenated and uplifted afterwards, almost as if they are places with otherworldly properties. Some have felt a connection with other beings while there. Well, one day during this trip, he decided to visit a certain spot that meant a lot to him as a kid. Steiger's case notes say it was an area to the side of the airport road, so to me it seems almost certain that he was visiting Airport Mesa. It's one of the most accessible and most popular viewing points in Sedona, and it is located right off the airport road. Now, interestingly, those who believe in vortex theory sometimes say that the entire area of Sedona is a vortex, but there are specific areas where they believe the energy is at its most significant. One is Boynton Canyon, another is Bell Rock, another is Cathedral Rock, but the other is Airport Mesa. It's known for its powerful energy and stunning view. So Carrie pulled his car over and walked to the Airport Mesa vantage point that he remembered from childhood. His parents used to bring him and Andrea to see the view from here, and it really is quite stunning. Well, even though Carrie knew all about this vortex stuff, he was not there for that. He just wanted to see the view again and remember some of the good times he had had with his family. He had no idea that he was about to meet someone on that mesa who would fill his life with both wonder and despair. Carrie reached Airport Mesa and was looking out onto the spectacular view when he noticed a young woman. She was sitting on a rock ledge and was meditating while overlooking the valley. Nothing unusual about that. You see plenty of people doing that at this spot. But there was something unusual about her, specifically her beauty. Carrie didn't want to be intrusive or creepy, but as he looked over at this woman deep in self-reflection with her eyes closed, he was just floored by how gorgeous she was. Her long black hair was braided into 2 strands. The braids were long enough to almost reach her waist. She had a pair of faded blue jeans on, as well as a white buckskin shirt. Buckskin is that soft and pliable leather which has been tanned for color in the same way deer skin is tanned in Native American culture. She was wearing one of those shirts, and he sat for a while, trying not to be intrusive, but he just couldn't help it. He kept looking over at her. And he said that for a very long time, all he could hear was the sound of a gentle breeze blowing through the pine trees, a hawk calling overhead, and the sound of his own heart beating. It was a magical moment. There was this notion in his head that he couldn't shake. Quote, "I know this sounds ridiculously romantic, but it truly seemed as though she was waiting there for me to arrive." Carrie sat there for what seemed like an age before this woman gradually came out of her meditation and gently opened her eyes, squinting for a moment in the bright Arizona sun. And then she quickly looked towards him and noticed him, and her large brown eyes met his, which is when she smiled at him. Straight away, she broke the silence. She called him over and said, "Hey, my name is Nara. Why don't you come and sit on the ledge with me?" He was thrilled that she'd asked, and so he hurried over. He plonked himself next to her, and they started talking, taking in the view together. And they kept talking, all the way up until the sun began to creep down toward the horizon. Conscious that it was to be dark soon, they knew it was time to leave the mesa, but neither were ready to leave each other. Their conversation just flowed, and so they agreed to go for a meal together. They went to a new Mexican restaurant in Sedona, and afterwards Carrie was delighted when Nara invited him back to her cabin. It turned out she lived in a gorgeous place in Sedona called Oak Creek Canyon. And she led him there, driving along the winding canyon road and then turning off on a dirt track that led down to her cabin, surrounded by tall pines. It was absolutely beautiful there. The night was like something from a fairy tale, and the connection between them was incredible. Nara invited him to stay over. He did. And then he spent the next day with her. And then the next. In fact, those days turned into a week. And then another week. And with every passing day, it was undeniable to him he was falling very quickly and comprehensively in love. Because of his dad's inheritance money, he still didn't have to head back to New York, and so those weeks stretched into 3 months. Yes, he fell very hard and said that Nara became his reason for existence. He stayed at her cabin in this wonderfully special place, and he would send his New York landlord checks each month to keep his apartment going. And as for work, a friend of his called Ray was forwarding mail to him. Sometimes it would be from his editors asking him to write an article, but when Carrie got these, he just looked at them and would throw them away. Writing articles had been an important part of his work life before, but now that he'd found Nara, it felt like being a magazine writer was something from an old life. And he was barely even interested in continuing his novel either. In fact, the story idea was fading from his memory, and he wasn't bothered because Nara was inspiring him with a new story that he would write, something that focused on how much he loved her. Towards the end of those 3 months, Carrie asked her straight out. He wanted her to return to New York with them, where they could be married. She smiled at this, but she shook her head. She said she was an Arizona girl. He kept pressing her, but she wouldn't budge. She said that her soul was somehow intertwined with the mountains and the deserts and the rocks there. She couldn't leave the place. Carrie tried to convince her. He said, look, he'd grown up in Arizona, but he'd moved on so she could too, but nope. Despite his promises of a brilliant life in the big city, she just found his excitement for New York amusing and not convincing. When she turned his offer down, she kept mentioning a frustrating phrase about her people. She said that her people had lived in the area for generations, and she didn't want to break that pattern. Now, Carrie wasn't exactly sure who she meant by this. Yes, from her looks, she could have been Native American, and yes, she listened to Native American music, especially the flute playing of Carlos Nakai. Yet she always denied having any specific tribal affiliation or name. Well, the 3rd month rolled into a 4th, and by then Carrie was acutely aware that he couldn't ignore New York forever. He decided that it would be wise for him to return to the big city, at least to just make sure his connections with the magazine editors were still going. He didn't want to lose out on that completely. And of course, he wanted to check on his apartment. 4 months is a very long time to leave it. So he told Nara that he would head back to the city, but not for long. He'd call her every day and would return to the cabin as soon as he could. Now, Nara had lived with him for months now, and they were incredibly close. But while he thought she might have been a little upset with his leaving, she wasn't. Not much, anyway. Perhaps that might have hurt his feelings. But things did change just before he left. You see, he climbed into the rental car on the day he was leaving, and he was going to drive to the airport in Phoenix, and when he went to look up at her, she was crying. He reassured her that he'd be back soon, and after a final look, he reluctantly fired up the car and drove, his eyes flitting from the road to the achingly gorgeous Nara and her pretty cabin that was dwindling in the rearview mirror. He drove the dirt track from her place and got back on the main winding road, through the canyon, and headed to the airport. Well, the flight went fine, and he got back to New York, and as soon as he dumped his bags in the apartment, he rushed to the phone and grabbed it. Remember, this is in the days before mobile phones. So he called her, ready to let her know that he had landed safely and he was finally back. And he was excited to hear her voice again. But as he sat back to hear it, he was shocked to hear something else instead, a recording that said,
"The number you have dialed is not in service."
Confused, he checked the number and tried again. Still nothing. During the interview, he told Steiger that he was exhausted from this flight and taxi ride, but he still phoned Nara about 12 times that night, but there was just no answer. He knew she'd be worried about him if he didn't get through to her, but there was little else he could do. So he went to bed, thinking he must have written the number down wrong, or maybe there was a glitch in the phone system and she'd be back online in the morning. Well, he tried again that next day, and he got the same recorded message. And he kept phoning her for 3 days, and every time the same dead end.
The number you have dialed is not in service. The number you have dialed is not in service.
He could write her a letter, of course, but that wasn't good enough for him. He needed to hear her voice again. And she was too important to leave, so he decided to cut his New York trip short and go back to Sedona just to check on her to make sure everything was okay. Once that was sorted, he could get back to New York with the right number this time and pick up from where he left off. He must have been particularly worried about her because this time he invited his friend Ray to come back with him for this quick check-in with Nara. After all, Carrie was keen to introduce the woman he loved to his best friend. Ray agreed, and they flew back to Arizona and drove out to Oak Canyon. And they traveled along the winding road that heads through the canyon. And yet something incredibly strange happened. Or didn't happen, I should say. Carrie couldn't find the dirt road, the one that came off the main road and headed down to her cabin. He made another pass to check, still no track. He drove back and forth along the stretch of road, but he found nothing. He said this, quote, "Ray kept looking at me like I was totally nuts. How could it be that I couldn't find the place where I had spent most of the past 4 months?" Once he realized the track was gone, Carrie had another idea. He'd park up and he and Ray would hike through the woods and they'd find Nara's cabin that way. Maybe the track had been covered over in a windstorm or something, as unlikely as that sounds. Ray took some persuading, but finally he agreed. And as they trekked through the forest looking for Nara's cabin, Ray was teasing him about not being able to find it. He said, "You should have sprinkled some breadcrumbs." Well, Carrie wasn't laughing. In fact, the more they staggered through the woods, seeing nothing but trees, the more he started to feel like he must be having some sort of mental collapse. Maybe all the pressure of his dad's death and the loss of his mother and sister, the pressure of the future, the desperate hope to write the novel. What if it had all gotten too much for him? Surely he couldn't have imagined Nara, could he? Well, they still found nothing after the first day, and by the second day of searching, even Ray had stopped joking about it. That's because by then, Carrie was dragging Ray to every bar, shop, and restaurant in Sedona. If he had been there with Nara, he went back. And whenever he found a staff member he recognized, he would ask them the same question. Namely, if they could remember him coming in for a drink or a meal these last 4 months, and crucially, if they remembered the beautiful dark-haired woman by his side. They all said they could remember him, but Ray's eyebrows shot up with what they said next. They could also remember her. "Ah, yes," they said, "the gorgeous young lady you ate meals with and laughed over drinks with. Oh, yes, we certainly remember both of you. You are very much in love, yeah?" He and Nara had even attended a Sedona sightseeing tour together, and so Carrie sought out that tour guide that took them around, and the guide nodded and said again, yes, she could remember the happy young couple very well. So this was utterly confusing and really quite unnerving. What on earth could be a rational explanation for this? Now sure, if they had found the cabin empty, this would be totally different. Nara would have just skipped town. But the cabin was as missing as she was, and even the dirt track to it no longer existed. After days of searching, he and Ray headed back to the airport, and he and Carrie flew east. Carrie being haunted by a situation that wasn't only mysterious, it was heartbreaking. Carrie had loved her so very much. Where did she go? Back in New York, Carrie admitted to Steiger that he'd almost had a nervous breakdown over this. But Ray was an incredibly supportive friend. Carrie said, and I quote, "I would have totally collapsed without his genuine friendship." But despite the support of his friend, Carrie did fall into a deep depression back in New York. He said he couldn't bring himself to leave his apartment for a few weeks. He couldn't be bothered to cook or look after himself either, and so the place began to be strewn with takeout boxes. It seemed like his life had started to collapse. But then, almost an entire year had passed, and by now he had started to assume he would never see Nara again. But then, one night. Despite a whole year passing, Carrie was still missing her, but he had managed to, quote, beat back some of the gloom. Yet she was never too far from his mind. And on that night in New York, he was sitting in his apartment, not only with Ray, but also with Ray's friend. She was called Brooke. They were discussing together the local art scene, writing, philosophy, but they were also talking about Nara. His friends had come to accept that it was almost impossible for Carrie not to bring her up into a conversation whenever he could. And they were good enough friends to know that when it comes to lost love, talking about the person really matters. It helps. So they let him talk about those magical months in the cabin. While they were deep in discussion about not only Nara, but also the latest theater openings in the city, when there was a sudden knock at his apartment door. This was surprising, because it was just after midnight. Confused, Carrie got up from the couch and headed to open up. Maybe he thought it could be a neighbor saying they were talking too loud. But it wasn't. He could barely believe what he was seeing. Because as he opened the door, he saw Nara standing there in the hallway. The shock was so intense that Carrie phrases it like this, quote, "I was astonished beyond speech to see my darling Nara suddenly standing before me." And as he stared at her in wonder, in shock, she looked back at him with a sense of peacefulness, but also a kind of amusement at his surprised expression. He said she was dressed in that white buckskin shirt again, but she wasn't wearing blue jeans this time, but a pair of black slacks. Maybe over this last year, Carrie had rehearsed in his mind what he would do and say if he ever saw Nara again, perhaps calling her out for abandoning him. But his natural instincts took over, and he just threw his arms around her in the hallway. And she embraced him back. Both of them were filled with elation, and they did what he described as, quote, a mad dance of love as they entered his apartment. Laughing and holding one another, Ray and Brooke heard the commotion and looked up to see Carrie walk in. And next to him was a woman. They knew straight away that this was the famous Nara, and Ray and Brooke's faces just lit up. She was real, she was right there. And they knew how much this meant to Carrie. And so Ray and Brooke chatted with Nara, but only for a few moments. They were captivated by her, but they were wise enough to know that she and Carrie needed to talk. And so they said how great it was to finally meet her, and then they left Carrie and her alone. Naturally, once they were gone, Carrie turned to her and said, "Where did you go?" She just looked at him, and when he asked again, she leaned towards him and placed a gentle finger against his lips. Whenever he asked her this question that night, she would do this gesture and she would say, "Let's not waste a moment. There will be time for questions and answers later. The most important thing is that I am here with you now." When they climbed into bed that night in Carrie's apartment, they made love, as they had done many times at the cabin. And then afterwards, he told Steiger that he slid his arms around her in bed and he held on to her as she slept. He wouldn't let her go. He was just so scared that she might leave him again. Eventually, he did fall asleep, with Nara, the love of his life, finally back in his arms. Much later in the night, he felt himself waking up, and he immediately reached over to check she was still there. The head wasn't on the pillow. And so he flicked his eyes open in panic, and she was there, propped up on her elbow, watching him in the darkness. He said her face was filled with love and kindness. She said she'd been watching how restless he was in sleep, and she asked him why that was. What was troubling him? She was curious. He told her the truth, as if it wasn't obvious. "I'm scared," he said. "I'm scared that if I go to sleep, you're going to vanish." She kept looking at him in the darkness as he said, "I've got this terrible feeling that you're not going to stay." She laughed at this, gently, but she gave him a wonderful look of care and affection, and she said, "Go to sleep, my love, go to sleep." He did, eventually, and the next time he opened his eyes, it was morning, and in the bright light of the rising sun, he saw the now empty space next to him in bed. She was gone. He knew she was gone too. He didn't get up to check the bathroom or the rest of the apartment. He knew he wouldn't find her. And more than that, it was different to last time, because he knew in that moment that he would never see Nara again. that there would be no point searching for her here or anywhere. And this time was different because back then there had been no trace of her cabin or the track, which had made him almost wonder if she'd been there at all. But he knew she'd been in the bed last night. He knew that for certain because he could still see the indentation in the pillow where her sleeping head had been. After the second and final disappearance of Nara, Carrie returned to Sedona twice. And though it was useless, he couldn't help himself. He visited some of the places he had been with her, and yes, if he ever asked, they said they remembered him just like before, and no, they had never seen her in Sedona again. Never without him. He told Steiger, "I might believe that I was crazy and imagined Nara and our love affair, but I at least have the testimonies of Ray and Brooke, who saw Nara with their own eyes, and I also have a statement from the maintenance man in my building who remembers seeing a dark-haired woman in a white buckskin shirt standing in front of my apartment just before she started knocking on the door. In spite of these testimonies and the kindness of friends, I shall undoubtedly be haunted by the memory of Nara for the rest of my life." Who was she? What was she? Carrie said he'd considered everything. Was she a ghost? An angel? Something beyond human understanding? And we might also ask, what was her purpose? You could even say Nara was cruel. Think about it, for a stranger to meet a man at an emotional low point in his life, to offer him 4 perfect months of pure love and happiness, and then to vanish, only to reappear 1 year later for one single night, and then vanish forever. That was cold, wasn't it? Particularly when he had lost every member of his family. Why do that to him? Or was this a case of it was better to have loved and lost than never loved at all? Did she gain something from the relationship? Was it love or sadism that kept her connected with him? Steiger discussed the case with various researchers and colleagues. Some wondered if she might not have been human, that she was somehow trying to understand human emotions, to learn from a human being about love. She had this curious nature about her, this inquisitiveness, and almost an amusement at the way he reacted to things. Others wondered if she might be some form of succubus. A succubus is a female demon or supernatural entity found in folklore. They're often depicted as incredibly beautiful women who appear in the dreams of men to seduce them, usually through sexual activity. In many of the tales, the creature is said to drain the energy of the man or even their life force. And after she left Carrie, he certainly did feel drained of life. The word succubus, by the way, comes from a Latin word meaning to lie beneath. The male counterpart of the succubus is the incubus. If there really is such a thing as a succubus, is that what Nara was? Is that why she used him for 4 months and 1 night? Well, Carrie did not believe this theory of Steiger's colleague. He repeatedly pointed out how affectionate and loving she was, and that her expressions of care for him were, in his mind, beyond doubt. Another paranormal researcher told Steiger a pretty wild claim. He said that Nara may have been some sort of alien, trying to become impregnated by a human to create a hybrid race. But again, that doesn't really pan out. If that was true, why did Nara stay with him for 4 months? You can't explain that by saying, well, it took her that long to get pregnant, because that doesn't explain why she came back to him for 1 night. And equally, if that one last night got her pregnant, then why have the gap of a year between? The alien baby theory doesn't make a great deal of sense. Besides, these speculations were completely rejected when Steiger later spoke to Carrie about them, and in confidence he admitted that he and Nara had always worn protection during sex. This was 1992. It was a crucial period in the AIDS epidemic, and there was no cure at that point, so safe sex practices were at their peak around then. If Nara had wanted a child, she would have insisted on unprotected sex or moved on to someone who would offer that. And yet she stayed with Carrie for months. Why? Could this have more to do with the vortex theory at Airport Mesa? It's said that these are places where unusual things happen. And this particular mesa is supposedly charged with a kind of electricity. It can sometimes make people's hair stand on end. People who meditate there claim to receive otherworldly communications, a sense of strange forces. Unusual lights have been reported in the sky in Sedona. Some visitors have claimed to have seen or felt unseen entities there. They can range from ethereal beings to more tangible forms. And interestingly, reports say that people who encounter a sense of presence in Sedona often say they feel that the presence is benign and not evil. There are also time anomalies reported at Airport Mesa, where people lose track of the time completely. Some have claimed to have felt they were up there for hours, and are shocked to learn that they were only there for a few minutes. Electronic devices sometimes malfunction on the mesa, as if affected by an unseen force, either of supernatural origin or a natural phenomena we don't understand yet. Some visitors to Airport Mesa also report having an intense emotional response to the place. Some feel euphoria, others a sense of deep sadness. And finally, there are reports of people visiting Airport Mesa and returning home only to have very intense and vivid dreams that would lead to profound personal insights and revelations. Well, that is the precise spot where Carrie claimed he met Nara. Could there really be places in this world where the barrier between dimensions or worlds is somehow thinner and even transversible? Was she from a place beyond our understanding? Is she still there today? Or is this just some stupid story made up? If you've ever visited any of the vortex points of Sedona, Arizona, do share your stories and your opinions on who or what Nara was and your own experiences of the mesas, particularly Airport Mesa. But for now, let me just share a simple thought to end. I kept wondering if Carrie had returned to Airport Mesa specifically in the hope of finding his lost love again. Maybe he knew she wouldn't be there, or at least she wouldn't be there for him anymore. Or maybe she was and saw him waiting for her. Maybe she wanted to reach out to him but couldn't for some reason, because they were from two different worlds. As Carrie sat there looking out at the beautiful landscape, he would see the iconic red rock formations we see today, which are the result of millions of years of erosion by wind, water, and ice. These elements have patiently chiseled away at the sandstone, creating the breathtaking landscapes that we admire today. And they've left shapes that are both familiar and surreal at the same time. And these rocks are set against a bright blue sky. The contrast of the red rocks and the blue sky has been said to be a symbol to some locals. It evokes the idea of two opposites uniting. The blue sky is water, which touches the red fire of the rocks. Water and fire are two elements that ought not exist together, and yet in Sedona they appear to join quite happily on that enchanted horizon. Perhaps it's a place that is designed to bring together different things and different worlds, like a lonely young man and a mysterious young woman who found one another where the rocks meet the sky. The world's changed a lot since 1992, but of course the rocks at Airport Mesa are still there. And perhaps when Carrie looked at them, sat on them now alone on that magical ridge, he thought of a love that was gone, but was never really gone. Not in the heart, not in the mind. Perhaps that is the type of love that still lives, only and always, in the fog. I'm Peter Laws, and you've been listening to Where Did She Go? Good night.